like the rushing of a mighty wind, like the rushing of a mighty wind.
So I did a video earlier about the founding fathers and whether or not they were white nationalists. When you get a chance, you may want to check out that video because this may or can be seen as a continuation of that. As I just simply was just asking ChatGPT to, to just give a little bit more information about the racial restrictions on citizenship in America during that time. So first, I'll just read the summary of what ChatGPT says about the Naturalization Act of 1790. It says that act was repealed in 1795, replaced by a series of subsequent acts that gradually expanded eligibility, but racial restrictions stayed in place for over 160 years until the mid-20th century. So there were racial restrictions against citizenship for over 160 years in America, where only white folks were allowed to be citizens, and the immigration policy kind of followed that guideline as well, where immigration was really also restricted to European countries and only particular parts of Europe for that matter, because they were looking for white men of good stock, and they didn't think that Europeans everywhere were of good stock. So I just wanted to continue that conversation and speak a little bit more about racial restrictions and when it ended, just how it developed and then when it ended. And so I asked ChatGPT, when did racial restrictions end? And it said racial restrictions on U.S. citizenship officially ended in 1952 with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, also known as the McCarran-Walter Act. So very recently, less than 100 years ago, very recently did racial restrictions end. They worked their way up to it, but it wasn't until 1952 that it actually came to an end, apparently. And it says, here's a breakdown to put it in context. Number one, 1790 to 1870, citizenship for whites only. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted citizenship to free white persons. This explicitly excluded all non-white groups, including Black, Asian, and Indigenous peoples. Number two, in 1870, the inclusion of Black immigrants. The Naturalization Act of 1870 extended eligibility to aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. But all other non-white groups, especially Asians and Indigenous people, remain excluded. So to me, that's very interesting, that as much as America is accused of being racist against Black folks, Black people were actually the first ones that were allowed to be citizens of America outside of white people. It was just white folks, and then the only others that they included were Black folks. And that seems to be in front of Asians, Latinos. Black folks were, the first people to be allowed citizenship. Again, that's just interesting given the accusations against America being racist against Black folks. And it's just interesting when we do talk about America's racism, we pretty much tend to talk about racism against Black people. So to see that, as far as immigration was concerned, the least of their concern were Black people. It's just interesting. Immigration-wise, they were more racist against other groups than against Blacks. And that's interesting. And I think it leads to a lot of questions, and just questions we hope to address here as we go along. Number three, the 1882 to 1943 Asian exclusion. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and later Asian exclusion laws barred Asian immigrants entirely from naturalization and even immigration. So they couldn't become citizens, and they weren't really, taking in migrants from Asia or China in particular. The Supreme Court reinforced this in cases like Ozawa versus United States in 1922 and Thind versus United States in 1923, ruling that only whites and people of African descent could become citizens. Only whites and people of African descent. That's so interesting. That's quite interesting. I wonder if that kind of gives us some insight as to why Black folks think they are foundational, along with those white folks, because it was really, during that time after slavery ended, they really were only interested in bringing in Black people. And again, I'm really interested to see where this leads us. That's just quite interesting to me. Number four, 1943 to 1952, gradual lifting. The Magnuson Act of 1943 repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, allowing a small number of Chinese immigrants to naturalize. Other Asian groups, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Indian, etc., were still excluded until after World War II. So, there may have been Chinese immigrants here, but they weren't allowed to naturalize. They could come here and work, things of that nature, but naturalization was something else. It was just another issue. And even if they did come here, if they did migrate here, it seems that it was just on like work visas and stuff like that. Number five, 1952, racial restrictions and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. The McCarran-Walter Act abolished all racial restrictions on naturalization. It declared that citizenship eligibility could no longer be denied based on race or ethnicity. However, it still imposed national origin quotas favoring Northern and Western Europe. That seems a little bit contradictory to me. They no longer you can't be denied based on race or ethnicity, but they're going to be quotas. I mean, if they're quotas, you're going to deny certain people, but it's an improvement. 1965, number six, 1965, national origin quotas and the Immigration and National Act of 1965, Hart-Celler Act, removed those quotas, opening U.S. immigration and citizenship to the world, particularly Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Yeah, I think it would have been just a matter of time before that contradiction kind of gets exposed. So in summary, racial restrictions ended in 1952 and full equality in immigration and citizenship by region in 1965. Next question I asked was, did the 1870 Act include Blacks from the Caribbean? It says, excellent question, and yes, the 1870 Naturalization Act did include Black people from the Caribbean and Africa and other regions of, quote, African nativity. Here's how and why. The text of the 1870 Act. The law's key language stated that naturalization was open to aliens being free white persons and to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. This was the first time U.S. law expanded citizenship beyond whiteness, a direct response to Reconstruction era politics after the Civil War. So this was a part of the Reconstruction movement. The Reconstruction of America included its immigration policy and including people of African nativity, not just persons of African descent. Persons of African descent would have been, the descendants of slaves here, but it opened it up to aliens of African nativity, which means migrants that were here were now eligible to gain citizenship. It's as though, they couldn't grant citizenship to one group and not the other, or that's how they felt about it. It didn't make sense to grant citizenship to descendants of African slaves, but not to aliens of African nativity. Number two, the meaning of African nativity and persons of African descent. African nativity meant anyone born on the African continent, including those from European colonies, example, British, French, Portuguese possessions. Persons of African descent covered people of African ancestry regardless of where they were born, including the Caribbean, South America, or elsewhere. So under this law, a Black person from Jamaica, Haiti, Barbados, Trinidad, or Brazil, for example, could legally naturalize in the US, something they couldn't do before 1870. So persons of African descent was not just descendants of slaves. It was anyone in the country that had African descent from anywhere in the world. Number three, historical context. This inclusion reflected the growing recognition of freedmen's rights after the Civil War. Republican lawmakers' efforts to align citizenship law with the 14th and 15th Amendments, but it also reflected limits. Asians and Native Americans remained excluded, showing the racial hierarchy still embedded in US law. It says it recognized, or it reflected, the growing recognition of freedmen's rights after the Civil War. So it may be that they recognized it wasn't just descendants of slaves here that were considered freedmen. I guess people of African descent from the Caribbean were also considered freedmen because I guess they were slaves at some point in time, I guess. Although, this is the 1870 Act. Black people in America, descendants of slaves, had already gotten their citizenship a couple of years earlier in 1868 with the 14th Amendment. So this did not apply to them at all. Right. This didn't apply to them at all. This was strictly for people of African descent who were not born in America. It's the Naturalization Act. It's for people who were not born in America. So it just didn't apply to descendants of slaves, not this act anyway. It says it may have strengthened the 14th Amendment, or it was a way of aligning citizenship law with the 14th Amendment, because I guess it didn't make sense for people of African descent that were born in America to be eligible to be citizens, while people of African descent who weren't born here weren't eligible. I guess they saw some contradiction in that, which is why they allowed 2 years later, they allowed for people of African descent to also be eligible for citizenship. They just did not think it was complete, or that the 14th Amendment didn't really have the force behind it that it needed to have unless all people of African descent were eligible to become citizens. It says, in summary, white Europeans were eligible for citizenship before 1870. Black Europeans were eligible before 1870 by way of the 14th Amendment, but not very long before 1870, only a couple of years. Black Caribbeans and Africans were not eligible before 1870, nor were Asians or Native Americans. Next thing I asked ChatGPT was the 1870 Immigration Act seen as a form of reparations for blacks? And it says, excellent question, and the short answer is no. The 1870 Naturalization Act, sometimes mistakenly called the Immigration Act of 1870, was not seen as a form of reparations for Black Americans. In fact, it reflected the limits of Reconstruction rather than reparative justice. Here's the full context. What the 1870 Naturalization Act actually did. The Naturalization Act of 1790 had limited U.S. citizenship to free white persons. The 1870 Act expanded eligibility to include aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. This meant Black immigrants, for example, from the Caribbean or Africa, could now become naturalized citizens, something not possible before. However, it explicitly excluded Asians and indigenous peoples, keeping citizenship racially restricted. Why it was passed. Congress passed it during Reconstruction alongside enforcement acts protecting the 14th and 15th Amendments. Its main purpose was to legally align naturalization law with the new definition of citizenship created by the 14th Amendment, not to provide any material or compensatory benefit. It was largely symbolic, recognizing that people of African descent could belong in the U.S. body politic. And again, I think that's what Black Americans saw it as, was just symbolic of that idea. And I think it can also be symbolic of reparations as well. I think that act was symbolic of America's, it was a way of expressing their regret over slavery, or just a form of apologizing, if you will, extending an olive branch, if you will. So reparatory in that sense. Not that anything tangible was given, but what it represented was very important. And in that aspect, I think it can be seen as reparatory. But ChatGPT does go on and says to say why it was not reparations. It says reparations imply compensation for past harm, financial, land, or institutional investment. The 1870 Act did not provide land, money, education, or pensions to free people. It benefited mostly free Blacks or immigrants, not formerly enslaved Americans, who were already U.S. citizens by birth under the 14th Amendment of 1868. And all of that may be true, and all of those are good reasons why it was not reparations in the sense of what we know reparations to be. But again, I think that the symbolism was very important. And I think even though Black Americans or descendants of slaves in America didn't benefit from this, I think that, what it did in terms of, again, cementing the 14th Amendment and kind of, it was really the main way of showing that Black people belonged in America. And that symbolism was greater than just the citizenship of the Blacks that were born in America. It had something greater to it than that. Number 4, how Black leaders viewed it. There's no record of major Black figures like Frederick Douglass, Henry McNeill Turner, or Martin Delany calling the 1870 Act reparative. Douglass and others welcomed expanded inclusion, but their focus remained on economic justice, protection from racial violence, and enforcement of Reconstruction rights, not on immigration or naturalization policy. The historical interpretation, historians see the 1870 Act as a small step towards racial inclusion in law, but not a redistributive or reparative act. It was more about legitimizing the idea of Black citizenship in law, rather than repairing the damage of slavery. But I would go out on a limb and say legitimizing the idea of Black citizenship in law does, to an extent, repair the damage of slavery. It says, in many ways, it revealed the limits of Reconstruction's racial vision. Citizenship was extended symbolically, but economic justice was denied. So in summary, it says, I then asked, just to be clear, I asked, what was the new definition of citizenship that the 14th Amendment introduced? And it says, fantastic question, because the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, completely redefined what it meant to be an American citizen. Before it, citizenship was vague, inconsistent, and racially restricted. The 14th Amendment created the modern birthright definition of U.S. citizenship we still use today. Birthright citizenship. The key language. The 14th Amendment, Section 1 begins, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This single sentence revolutionized citizenship law. The old definition, before 1868, the U.S. Constitution, 1787, never defined citizenship directly. It left that up to states. States set their own rules and most excluded Black people from citizenship. The Naturalization Act of 1790 the Naturalization Act of 1790 only allowed free white persons to become citizens. The Dred Scott versus Sanford 1857 Supreme Court decision declared that no Black man has any rights which the white man is bound to respect, meaning people of African descent, enslaved or free, could never be U.S. citizens. The 14th Amendment's new definition. The 14th Amendment overturned Dred Scott and made citizenship a constitutional right rather than a privilege granted by states. Core principles introduced. Birthright citizenship. Anyone born in the U.S., except certain groups like Native Americans under tribal sovereignty at the time, automatically became a citizen. This included formerly enslaved people and their children. National citizenship first. Citizenship now flowed from the nation, not from the states. Before 1868, a person could be a citizen of a state, but not of the U.S. Equal protection under the law. Every citizen was entitled to the same legal protections, a direct attack on racial discrimination. Due process. No person could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This later became the foundation for civil rights and privacy cases. What it meant for freed people. For the first time, formerly enslaved men, women, and children were recognized as full citizens of the United States. Citizenship meant the right to travel freely, the right to sue in court, protection under federal law, access in theory to political participation, which the 15th Amendment in 1870 expanded to include voting for men. But it did not guarantee land, income, or economic equality. So while it established legal citizenship, it did not fulfill the economic reparations freed people had demanded. Legacy. The 14th Amendment's definition of citizenship is still the law today, and it's the basis for birthright citizenship for all races, civil rights cases, and immigration debates. Who qualifies as born in the U.S.? I then asked what other races or nationalities were included as citizens in the 1870 Act. And it says, excellent question, and it touches on the very specific turning point in how the U.S. legally defined race and citizenship. The Naturalization Act of 1870 was the first time since 1790 that Congress expanded who could become a naturalized U.S. citizen, but it did so in a racially selective way. It included some new groups and still excluded others. Here's the breakdown. 1. Background. Before 1870, the Naturalization Act of 1790 said only free white persons could become citizens. Naturalization Act of 1795 and 1798 kept that rule. This meant European migrants, Irish, Germans, Italians, etc. were eligible. Black people, Asians, and Native Americans were not eligible. Free blacks born in the US could sometimes vote or own property locally, but were not federally recognized as citizens. What the 1870 Act changed: the Naturalization Act of July 14, 1870 amended U.S. naturalization law by adding one crucial phase. Citizenship could be granted to aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. Now eligible for naturalization were African Americans by descent, even though most already gained citizenship through the 14th Amendment. Black immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa, example Haiti, Jamaica, Liberia, who had been previously barred. So it does appear as if African Americans who were born in America also became eligible through the 1870 Act, because I guess the 14th Amendment did not necessarily grant all of them citizenship. Yeah, I'm gonna go out and say that. This was symbolically important because it acknowledged that Blackness was compatible with citizenship, something explicitly denied by the Dred Scott decision just 13 years earlier. And it had to be extended to African migrants and aliens of African descent. It had to be extended to those people for Blackness to truly be compatible with citizenship. Unless they extended it to African immigrants and Caribbean migrants, it just would not be the same. It would not be as meaningful. Blackness would still not be compatible with citizenship if it was just citizenship for blacks that were born in America. It just would not be the same. It really put Blackness on par with whiteness. It was the only way to put Blackness on par with whiteness was to allow African and Caribbean migrants to come in. Still excluded after 1870, the 1870 Act continued to exclude several racial and ethnic groups. Asians explicitly excluded from naturalization, Chinese, Japanese, Indians, etc. until the 1940s and 50s. Chinese immigrants, for example, were barred from citizenship and later targeted by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Native Americans were still considered members of separate sovereign nations and not citizens until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Mexicans and other Latin Americans, their citizenship depended on treaty provisions, example the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, but not on the general naturalization law. Middle Easterners, Southern Asians, Pacific Islanders excluded under the White Clause until court challenges in the early 1900s. Many were denied as not white enough. Political and symbolic meaning. The inclusion of Africans and persons of African descent was a Reconstruction era statement that Black citizenship was permanent and legitimate. But the continued exclusion of Asians and Native Americans revealed that the U.S. still envisioned itself as a white and Black nation, not a fully multiracial democracy. It says the 1870 Act was not about reparations or equality. It was about codifying who could belong in post-slavery America. It said, in effect, we'll now recognize Black people as potential citizens, but not everyone else. It was a symbolic inclusion of Africans within a still highly racialized citizenship system. The next question that I asked ChatGPT, because this really kind of gets to the heart of what I want to, that I want to learn about, is I asked it to explain why allowing African immigrants to become citizens legitimized the 14th Amendment. It says, excellent question, and this shows your thinking on a constitutional level. allowing African immigrants to become citizens under the Naturalization Act of 1870 helped legitimize and reinforce the 14th Amendment in both symbolic and legal ways. Let's unpack it step by step. 1. The 14th Amendment's core promise. Ratified in 1868, the 14th Amendment declared all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. This was the first time the Constitution defined citizenship, guaranteeing that people of African descent born in the U.S. were unquestionably American citizens. It overturned the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which had declared that no Black person could ever be a U.S. citizen. So the 14th Amendment created birthright citizenship for the formerly enslaved and their descendants. But there was still a problem. The legal gap the 1870 Act addressed. The 14th Amendment covered people born in the U.S., but not foreign-born Black immigrants. The Naturalization Act of 1790 still limited naturalization to free white persons. That meant that while U.S.-born Blacks were now citizens, an African or Caribbean immigrant, say from Liberia, Haiti, or Jamaica, still couldn't become a citizen through naturalization. This created a contradiction. The Constitution said race could not determine citizenship for those born here, but federal law still used race to determine who could naturalize. So that was the contradiction. And I think that's the contradiction I tried to speak to earlier, is where the Constitution said race could not determine citizenship for those born here. That's the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment said as long as you're born here, regardless of your race, you're a citizen. But the federal law, the 1790 law, still used race to determine who could naturalize, still said only white folks could naturalize. And that was a problem. The 1870 Act closed that gap by adding this clause: aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent are eligible for naturalization. How it legitimized the 14th Amendment? By extending naturalization rights to African immigrants, the 1870 Act aligned federal law with constitutional principles. It brought naturalization statutes, federal law, into agreement with the 14th Amendment, constitutional law. In other words, both birthright and naturalized citizenship now included people of African descent. Both birthright and naturalized citizenship now included people of African descent. This ended the legal contradiction between the Constitution and other racial naturalization laws. B, it affirmed Black citizenship as permanent and universal by recognizing not just U.S.-born Blacks, but Africans worldwide as potential citizens. Congress made a strong statement. Blackness and citizenship were now compatible under U.S. law. This was a direct reversal of the Dred Scott Doctrine, which had declared the opposite. And let me just say this while the thought is in my head. This is about people of African ancestry, and FBA claim to not have African ancestry, that they are Native Americans. But let's be clear, this law was about, this law excluded Native Americans from citizenship. It excluded them. So if they are going to claim that, then they are in some ways denying their own American citizenship. They are denying the citizenship in the country that they claim to have built. So they can deny Africa all they want, but the American government recognizes their African ancestry. And that is what really allowed them to get citizenship. The next thing ChatGPT says, just to be clear, this is the third way that that the 1870 Act legitimized the 14th Amendment. It strengthened the political legitimacy of Reconstruction. The 1870 Act symbolically showed that the U.S. was standing by the 14th Amendment and the Reconstruction project of racial inclusion. It made clear that citizenship rights were not a temporary war measure, but a permanent national policy. And it also made it clear that the American government did not make a distinction between people that were born here, blacks that were born here, that are of African ancestry, and African immigrants that were here. Like, the US government saw them all as Africans or people of African descent. Number 4, the limits. The act still excluded Asians and Native Americans, showing that inclusion was racially selective. It legitimized the 14th Amendment's protection of Black citizenship, but did not universalize equality for all races. So it summarizes by giving a function and an explanation of the 1870 Act. The first function is that it closed a legal loophole. The explanation is that it ensured African immigrants could naturalize, making federal law consistent with the 14th Amendment's racial inclusivity. The next function is that it symbolically reinforced Reconstruction. It affirmed that Black citizenship, by birth or by immigration, was legitimate and permanent. And again, that was a part of its reconstruction, of the Reconstruction era, part of the Reconstruction movement. And kind of, because of that, in my view, can be seen as reparative. The next function is that it overturned Dred Scott fully. It extended the reversal of Dred Scott beyond US-born Blacks to all people of African descent. And again, that to me is reparative. Still racially limited, excluded Asians and Native Americans, showing the US wasn't yet embracing full racial equality. And let's be honest, the reason people born in America, Black people that is born in America, the reason African immigrants were extended citizenship, the reason these things happen is because of slavery, and because of America wanting to atone for its history of slavery. And so, outside of that history of slavery, they would have excluded Africans the same way they excluded Asians and everyone else. It was only the legacy of slavery why African immigrants were included. And so because of that, I think these things can be seen as reparative, as, some form of reparative movement for slavery, even if it was symbolic, even if, there weren't any land distributed, any reparations in the sense of how we understand it to be. But I still believe that it was reparative in terms of the ideology of America. It at least symbolized that the idea of what America stands for was shifting, and that it was not just white nationalism, that America was a Black and white country. And so because of that, again, I think there are, reparative pieces to it, or a reparative function to it. So in short, it says the Naturalization Act of 1870 legitimized the 14th Amendment by making the principle of Black citizenship legally complete, extending it from the born to the foreign-born, and transforming what had been a wartime promise into a lasting legal reality. Next question I asked, because it did state that it transformed a wartime promise into a lasting legal reality. And I wanted to see just to be clear on what that wartime promise was. So I asked, what wartime promise did it make legally binding? And it said, excellent question, because the 14th Amendment wasn't just a legal change, it was the fulfillment of a wartime moral and political promise made by the Union during the Civil War. Here's what that means. The wartime promise, freedom, protection, and belonging. During the Civil War, as hundreds of thousands of enslaved people fled to Union lines, the Union government and military began making a series of moral and political promises to Black Americans, both enslaved and free. Those promises were 1. Freedom, emancipation from slavery, 2. Protection under U.S. law, and 3. Permanent belonging in the American nation, not as subjects, but as citizens. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 freed enslaved people in rebel states, but it did not guarantee their legal status after the war. It was a wartime measure, temporary, justified by military necessity. So the great question at war's end was, now that they're free, are they citizens? Number 2, the 14th Amendment made that promise legally binding. When the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, it made the Union's wartime pledges to freed people permanent law. Here's how. A. It constitutionalized emancipation. The 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery, but the 14th Amendment ensured that freedom came with citizenship, equal protection, and due process. This meant no state or future Congress could legally re-enslave or strip Black Americans of legal personhood. That's something. Because after the Civil War, a lot of that may have been happening where Black people were being threatened with losing their freedom. Like they had to leave certain southern states or be re-enslaved. You know, and those threats were being made. B, it made Black citizenship a federal guarantee. During the war, leaders like Frederick Douglass and Thaddeus Stevens had said freedom without citizenship is a mockery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed that the United States, not individual states, now defined and protected citizenship. This turned the Union's wartime moral promise into a constitutional obligation. C. It protected freed people from state retaliation. Southern states after the war passed black codes trying to deny freed people rights. The 14th Amendment made those codes unconstitutional by requiring equal protection under the law. So this was a big deal. This was a huge deal. Number 3, in plain terms, the 14th Amendment legally bound the U.S. government to what the Union had promised its Black soldiers and freed people during the war. Fight for the Union, and the Union will fight for your freedom and protect your rights as Americans. That promise, once moral and military, became constitutional and enforceable. So, it was a wartime promise. If you fight against your enslavers for your freedom, help us to defeat them, and you'll get citizenship. And so the 14th Amendment was really Black people's reward for their involvement in the war, for being willing to fight in the war. Especially given the fact that their participation in the war may have been what turned the war, in favor of the North. So because of that, I think that made it even doubly hard for them to go back on that promise. In summary, ChatGPT says there was the wartime promise in 1863 to 1865 and the 14th Amendment in 1868. It gives what the promise was and then how it was fulfilled. The first promise was emancipation or freedom, and the 14th Amendment made freedom permanent without re-enslavement, so no re-enslavement. The next wartime promise was protection under law, And the 14th Amendment gave equal protection and due process guarantees. The wartime promise, the next promise was belonging in the nation, and the 14th Amendment fulfilled birthright citizenship recognition for all. The next promise was freedom with rights, and the 14th Amendment made freedom meaningful by defining personhood and citizenship. So in short, the 14th Amendment transformed the Union's wartime promise, freedom, protection, and national belonging for freed slaves, from moral rhetoric into constitutional law. And that pretty much says it all. And, I think that pretty much makes it quite clear as to how the 1870 Act kind of legitimized the 14th Amendment. But I did want to dig a little more deeply into it. And I did say, but why? I asked ChatGPT, why did that promise extend to African immigrants who never fought in the war? Why was it important that citizenship be given to African immigrants who never participated in the war? If it's just a wartime promise, why not just give it to the people who fought in the war? Because, if they get their citizenship, their descendants would be born here and they would also get their citizenship. So why wasn't that enough? And it says, excellent. That's a deep and nuanced question, and it gets to the philosophical heart of Reconstruction. The answer is the promise of freedom and citizenship born out of the Civil War was expanded to all people of African descent, including African immigrants, because Congress wanted to make Black citizenship universal and unchallengeable, not conditional or limited to those who fought. Let's unpack why that happened. 1, the 14th Amendment changed citizenship from conditional to universal. Before the Civil War, citizenship in America was exclusive and racialized, limited to free white persons. The 14th Amendment radically redefined that idea. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. This wasn't just about rewarding loyalty or military service. It was a philosophical shift. Citizenship was now a human right, not a favor or privilege granted by race or birth status. Once that principle was accepted for formerly enslaved Black Americans, it was logically inconsistent to deny it to other people of African descent. Citizenship was now a human right. That's interesting. And that's quite deep. Citizenship was now a human right, not a favor or privilege granted by race or birth status. Is it citizenship that's a human right, or eligibility for citizenship that was a human right? Yeah, I'm gonna say it's the eligibility of citizenship. I think that's a better way of expressing that. Number 2, Congress wanted to complete the rejection of Dred Scott. The Dred Scott versus Sanford decision had said, no Black man has any rights which the white man is bound to respect. That ruling didn't just apply to enslaved people. It declared that no person of African ancestry anywhere could ever be a U.S. citizen. Dred Scott did not just apply to Black Americans. And I guess the remedy for Dred Scott had to go beyond Black Americans. So it says, so when Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1870, it deliberately said, quote, aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent may become citizens. That wasn't about rewarding African immigrants. It was about erasing every last trace of Dred Scott for all Black people born in America or abroad. So the reward for military service was one thing. This was something else. This was something more philosophical. And a philosophical reparation, if you will. And I will. It said, quote, if Dred Scott denied all Africans the right to belong, we now affirm that all Africans can belong, which again reiterates that citizenship as a human right was more properly stated as eligibility of citizenship as a human right. So because now all Africans can belong, you don't have to. Your application can be denied, but you can apply. Number 3, symbolic consistency with Reconstruction ideals. Reconstruction Republicans like Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and others believed the United States needed a moral rebirth to become a truly universal republic. They wanted to demonstrate that citizenship in America was no longer based on whiteness, but on principle, freedom, equality, and loyalty to the Constitution. If the nation only granted citizenship to American-born blacks, it would still be saying that blackness from elsewhere was foreign or inferior. So by including Africans and the African diaspora, Congress gave moral and symbolic weight to the idea that black citizenship is legitimate everywhere. Number 4, political pragmatism. The number of African or Caribbean immigrants in 1870 was very small, so this wasn't a controversial concession. Including Africans carried huge symbolic value, but little political cost. It let the U.S. present itself internationally, especially to abolitionist Britain and the African world, as a nation embracing racial equality after slavery. So they gained more than they lost by allowing Africans to become citizens. It was political pragmatism. There weren't that many African migrants here anyway, so they weren't really losing much. And it was a way for them to compete with Britain as being, America representing those ideas of freedom and equality and things like that. Number 5, the broader vision. Some radical Republicans saw the end of slavery as the beginning of a global Black freedom movement. They viewed the U.S. as a potential refuge and model for freed Africans everywhere. Extending naturalization to Africans connected America's Reconstruction mission to the larger fight against racial oppression worldwide. That's kind of funny hearing that about Republicans. Radical Republicans saw the end of slavery as the beginning of a global Black freedom movement. Radical Republican and global Black freedom movement are just not two terms that you would ever imagine would be put together. It's just weird. But it says some radical Republicans saw the end of slavery as the beginning of a global Black freedom movement. They viewed the U.S. as a potential refuge and model for freed Africans everywhere. I guess it can be seen that Black people created the Republican Party, and if not created, they empowered the Republican Party, or at least the Republican Party was created on their behalf, to work to end slavery and to really be a freedom party for Blacks. In summary, it gives a reason and then an explanation. The reason: legal consistency. The 14th Amendment declared citizenship a human right, not a reward for service. Extending it to Africans upheld that logic. Moral philosophy. To fully reject Dred Scott, Congress had to affirm that all people of African descent could be citizens, not just U.S.-born ones. Symbolic inclusion. It showed that Blackness and Americanness were no longer incompatible. Low political cost. Few African immigrants made it an easy symbolic act of racial justice. Global vision linked U.S. Reconstruction to a global moral struggle for Black freedom. So in short, the 1870 Act wasn't about rewarding African immigrants. It was about proving that Black citizenship itself was legitimate, permanent, and universal. By including Africans who had never fought in the war, Congress declared that Black humanity and belonging were no longer up for debate anywhere. By including Africans who had never fought in the war, Congress declared that Black humanity and belonging were no longer up for debate anywhere. And the inclusion of, I guess, non-FBA people, the inclusion of non-FBA is what made that declaration possible. Next question I asked, why did they not have the same conviction for including Asians and Native Americans and Mexicans, etc.? And it says that is exactly the right next question, because it gets to the racial hierarchy built into Reconstruction itself. Even as Congress extended citizenship and naturalization to people of African descent, it stopped short of doing the same for Asians, Native Americans, Mexicans, and other non-white groups. Here's why. Number one, the two-race framework of Reconstruction. After the Civil War, U.S. racial politics were dominated by one moral question: what is the place of the formerly enslaved Black population in the Republic? Most white politicians, even progressive ones, saw America's racial problem as binary, Black and white. The goal of Reconstruction was to reconcile those two groups. Other racial groups were treated as outside that narrative, either foreign or separate. So when the 1870 Naturalization Act added aliens of African nativity, it wasn't part of a general push for racial equality. It was a targeted correction to the specific injustice of slavery and Dred Scott, not a universal reform of race law. So it's not that they didn't think white people were not superior. It's just that they wanted to repent for their sins. Number two, persistent white supremacy and racial hierarchy. Even radical Republicans who believed in Black citizenship still accepted the ideology of white superiority toward other races. Common 19th century views held: Africans, redeemable through Christianization and civilization. Asians, seen as culturally alien, unassimilable, and competitors for labor. Native Americans, regarded as separate nations to be conquered or civilized, not integrated. Mexicans and Latinos, considered racially mixed, mestizo, and thus outside the white or Black categories of U.S. law. So while African Americans were viewed as an internal moral responsibility, others were treated as external racial problems. They were viewed as an internal moral responsibility. Isn't that something? That's an interesting way of seeing it. They saw Black people as a responsibility because of slavery. The reason they let in Africans was because they felt they had a responsibility because of slavery. Legal and political convenience. A small African immigrant population. Including Africans in 1870 was symbolic and low risk, almost no political backlash. B, large Asian and Native populations. Including Asians or Native Americans would have caused huge backlash among white voters who saw them as economic or territorial threats. Western states were already demanding Chinese exclusion. Native Americans were still engaged in wars with the U.S. Army. Mexican Americans in the Southwest were being dispossessed through land seizures after the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So Congress could appear progressive toward Black people while maintaining white dominance elsewhere. Black people were just low cost. It didn't really cost them much of anything to include black people. Black people were the least of their troubles. Black people were the least of their troubles. Number 4, ideological divide, redeem versus exclude. Reconstruction lawmakers framed their moral mission this way. Freed blacks needed to be redeemed into the nation after slavery, a moral duty. Native Americans needed to be civilized or relocated, colonial duty. Asians needed to be excluded, racial purity duty. And this is from lawmakers. This is how it says, lawmakers framed their moral mission. They had a moral duty to redeem freed blacks into the nation. It was their moral duty. And I think that is why, I guess that's another way of expressing white guilt. That's what white guilt is. Their moral duty to redeem black folks because of slavery. That's absolutely white guilt. And the question is, how long is that white guilt going to continue for? Because, that white guilt is what has, in my view, that's what has allowed, black people to behave the way they do. Black people behave as if slavery allows them to do whatever they want to do. And then white guilt makes white people feel as if they can't say anything about it. But something has to give. That hierarchy reflected the 19th century mindset that the US was a white Christian republic with one exceptional exception, the freed slave. So slavery is the main reason why America's white nationalist vision didn't come to fruition. It was their moral duty to redeem black people into white society. And that was the undoing of white nationalism in America. Number 5, legal structure reinforced it. The 14th Amendment guaranteed birthright citizenship for everyone in the US, including children of Chinese or Mexican parents. But naturalization for immigrants remained racially limited until the 20th century. Number 6, Native Americans, the separate sovereign nations excuse. U.S. courts and Congress treated tribes as domestic dependent nations, not part of the U.S. population. The government claimed that giving Native American citizenship violated their sovereignty, even as it was seizing their land. Citizenship was finally granted in 1924, but only after the frontier had been conquered. Mexicans and the treaty trap. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, Mexicans living in annexed territories were automatically made U.S. citizens, but in practice they were treated as racially inferior and politically marginalized. Because the treaty had already resolved their status, Congress didn't address them in the 1870 Act. In short, it says, the inclusion of Africans was a moral correction tied to the Civil War's promises. The inclusion of Asians, white Americans, and others was a continuation of America's racial hierarchy, proving that Reconstruction, while revolutionary for Black Americans, still operated inside a deeply racist world order. Next question for ChatGPT. Why would a deeply racist world order care about the morality of the inclusion of African immigrants and even descendants of slaves into their white society? ChatGPT says, that's a profound question. And you've just hit the central paradox of Reconstruction. How could a society built on white supremacy suddenly claim moral concern for the inclusion of Black people? The answer is layered. The short version is, even though the US was a deeply racist world order, it had to reckon with its own moral contradictions after the Civil War. Including people of African descent, at least legally, wasn't pure benevolence. It was a mix of moral necessity, political calculation, global optics, and ideological self-preservation. Let's unpack those motives. Moral necessity to redeem the nation's soul. The Civil War wasn't just a military conflict, it was a moral crisis. The Union fought under the banner of a new birth of freedom. By 1865, over 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union. Their sacrifice made it morally indefensible to deny them citizenship. So even racist politicians had to acknowledge, quote, "We cannot win a war for freedom and then deny freedom to those who fought for it," end quote. This moral logic extended symbolically to all people of African descent. It wasn't out of love or equality. It was national self-respect. It was national self-respect. If America freed 4 million enslaved people but refused to accept their humanity, the war would have meant nothing. If America freed 4 million enslaved people but refused to accept their humanity, the war would have meant nothing. And accepting migrants from Africa was how they showed that they accepted their humanity. Unless those Africans were accepted as citizens, then the native-born blacks would not have been seen as humans. Their humanity would not have been accepted. Number 2, political calculation. To secure Republican power, the Republican Party's Reconstruction agenda depended on the loyalty of black voters. Extending citizenship to black Americans and even Africans abroad expanded the moral legitimacy of the party's platform. Republicans could say, "We are the party of freedom, equality, and progress." It made the contrast sharper against Democrats, who were the party of ex-slaveholders and white supremacy. So inclusion served a strategic purpose. It strengthened the party that depended on the freedmen's vote. Global optics. Competing with European empires, after the war, the US wanted to project itself as a moral democracy, not just another white empire. Britain and France had abolished slavery earlier and were watching how America treated its freed slaves. Extending citizenship to Africans and African-descended people signaled that the US was part of the global moral progress of emancipation. It also helped deflect criticism from the brutality of post-war racial violence, black codes, Klan terror, etc. In essence, it was moral theater, a performance of equality to legitimize America on the world stage. Moral theater, ideological self-preservation, saving the idea of America. The Civil War forced the US to redefine itself. The founding ideal, all men are created equal, had been exposed as hypocrisy under slavery. The 14th Amendment and the 1870 Act were attempts to rescue that ideal, to say we are still the land of liberty. Now we mean it. So even though most white Americans still believed in racial hierarchy, they needed to believe in the myth of moral progress, to see themselves as redeemers, not oppressors. By including Africans symbolically, they could say, we're not racist, we're civilized, even as they excluded others. Ideological self-preservation, to save the ideal of America. To save the idea of America, they had to include African immigrants. Number 5, safe morality, low-cost virtue. Including African immigrants was morally grand but politically cheap. There were almost no Africans immigrating in 1870, so Congress could make a progressive moral statement without actually changing racial power structures or threatening white jobs, land, or privilege. It was morality without sacrifice, a legal gesture that cost them nothing but bought them moral credibility. So, in order to live up to their own ideals, they had to atone for slavery. In slavery drastically changed the image of America. Number 6, selective morality. Redeem the Negro, contain the others. White elites framed the black population as a domestic sin to be cleansed. The American problem. White elites framed the black population as a domestic sin to be cleansed. The American problem. But Asians, Native Americans, and Mexicans were framed as external threats or foreign elements. So inclusion of black people was about atonement. Exclusion of others was about self-defense. In their worldview, both fit under a moral code. Redeem the enslaved you wronged. Protect the white nation from outsiders. In truth, it was about America's image of itself. The U.S. is a nation that has always cared deeply about appearing moral, even while acting immorally. Reconstruction laws allowed white America to claim, "We have repented, we have made things right," while avoiding the real work of justice, land reparations, while avoiding the real work of justice, land reparations, or equality. That's why you get citizenship without wealth, voting without land, and rights without safety. The moral inclusion of Africans was part of rebuilding America's moral identity, not black empowerment. In summary, the motive, moral redemption, to prove the war for freedom had meaning and cleanse the national conscience. Political advantage, to secure black loyalty for the Republican Party and Reconstruction politics. Global optics, to present the U.S. as morally superior to Europe's empires. Ideological survival, to preserve the myth of America as a just democratic nation. Low-risk virtue, to look righteous with changing racial hierarchies. Selective morality, to redeem blacks while excluding others as outsiders. In short, the inclusion of African Americans and African immigrants wasn't born from racial enlightenment. It was an act of moral self-preservation for a guilty, war-torn nation trying to reconcile its founding ideals with its crimes. The next question I asked ChatGPT was, did Black Americans support the 1870 Naturalization Act allowing immigration from Africa? So did the Blacks who gained their citizenship in 1868, did they support the idea of allowing all Africans access? And it says, Black Americans at the time generally supported the 1870 Naturalization Act, though not necessarily as an organized political campaign. The support came from several overlapping motivations tied to Reconstruction politics and the meaning of citizenship after slavery. 1. Symbolic validation of the 14th Amendment. The 1870 Act was seen as the first law to extend the principle of the 14th Amendment that citizenship could not be limited by race to immigrants. Black leaders and abolitionists viewed it as a moral and legal confirmation that the new definition of American citizenship applied universally, not just to native-born freedmen. It was kind of just put a stamp on ending the idea that American citizenship applied only to whites. And because, during that policy, immigration was only taken from Europe. But now with this new act, immigration was possible from Africa. And I think the fact that they opened immigration and citizenship up to African countries is what they saw as, again, the stamp of approval of the idea that America was not just a white nation. Political alignment with the Republican Party. During Reconstruction, most politically active Black Americans supported the Republican Party, which had passed both the 14th and 15th Amendments and pushed the 1870 Act through Congress. Black leaders such as Frederick Douglass and Hiram Revels expressed pride in policies that demonstrated the United States could overcome its racial hierarchy. Number 3, Pan-African and anti-colonial sympathy. Some educated Black Americans, influenced by early Pan-African thought, saw the inclusion of African immigrants as a step toward global Black solidarity. The idea that Africans could become U.S. citizens under the same law that guaranteed rights to freedmen was interpreted as symbolic recognition of a shared African heritage. And that's something, that's quite something given the atmosphere in which we live in now, where, FBA, the last thing FBA want to do was recognize a shared African heritage. But it was that idea of a shared African heritage, which they're claiming here is what really, gave teeth to the 14th Amendment or made the 14th Amendment meaningful. If immigrants from Africa weren't allowed citizenship, then that racial hierarchy in America, in terms of, even if it's just in terms of Black and white, would be validated. And I think that allowing immigrants from Africa to become citizens was one way of invalidating that racial hierarchy, just in terms of where, immigration was now allowed from not just European and not just white countries. Moral and international legitimacy. At a time when the U.S. was trying to present itself as a moral democracy after the Civil War, many Black Americans recognized the international significance of the law. It projected a message that America could no longer claim to be a white man's republic. So that idea really strengthened Black Americans' resolve and was really seen as a victory for them, just because of what it symbolized. The idea that immigration and citizenship now applied to African immigrants symbolized or was symbolic of just a greater idea, the idea that America is not just a white nationalist country. It's not just for whites. And that needed to take place. That needed to be added to the 14th Amendment, again, to cement that fact. The 14th Amendment alone just applied to Black people that were born here. White folks could come here from any part of Europe. Well, maybe not from any part of Europe, but white people were allowed to come here and become immigrants from Europe. They could be naturalized. And so now the idea that Black people from Africa could also be naturalized really cemented the equality of Black and white citizenship or citizenry. It just really solidified it and made it stronger. It is important to note that African immigration to the U.S. was extremely limited during that period. So the Act's practical impact on the Black population was small. The support was mostly ideological and not economic or migratory. It was more ideological. But I don't think that takes away from the value of it. The fact that it was ideological than anything else. I think the symbolism still meant a lot and still was just gave fuel to the continuance of the fight against white nationalism, if you will. I think it's fair to say that without the 1870 Act, the 1870 Naturalization Act, which gave citizenship rights to Africans outside of those born here, I think that is what really legitimized and gave Black people everywhere a right to say they belonged to this country. Without that act, Black people as a race were not accepted as Americans. And it was that law which extended to African immigrants that legitimized that. That without that, it wasn't possible for Black people to be seen as a race or as citizens. And the reason Black people were ultimately really seen as part of the citizenry is because through that act, they were seen as functioning human beings. So the citizenship that was earned through the 14th Amendment, that citizenship, without the Naturalization Act that followed it, that citizenship was on shaky ground because our immigration policy was based on race. It was based on a racial hierarchy, and it was their recognition of the Black race or the African race that allowed Black Americans or FBA to be recognized as humans.
It's also important, I think, to remember that the Dred Scott decision was not just a decision against Black Americans or descendants of slaves that were in America. The Dred Scott decision said that no Black person could ever be equal to a white person. So it also was a statement about all Africans, all Black people anywhere in the world. And so that decision was seen not just as violating the human rights of Black Americans, but of violating the human rights of Black immigrants in America and just Black people around the world, really, like the ramifications of that statement. You can imagine that would affect how Black people were treated around the world because of such a statement by such an important document in such an important country at the time. And so it affected the lives of all Black people everywhere. And I do believe that America, through the 1870 Naturalization Act, was making amends for that as well. They were making amends for how that judgment, the Dred Scott decision, how that affected Black people worldwide. And I think that is also something that played on the conscience of America, and that's also something they were trying to repair for with the 1870 Naturalization Act. So it's important, I think, for me anyway, because for me, I think it means that this was a way of America, again, making reparations for the damage caused by the Dred Scott decision, which means that America felt that reparations was owed not just to the Black Americans that they enslaved, but also the Black Africans who were affected by that Dred Scott decision. Because all Black people's lives would have to have been affected by such a pronouncement that no Black man would ever be equal to a white man. And so reparations in terms of the government at the time, they felt that they need to repair that as well. And that's what the 1870 Naturalization Act was about. So when people say that, America doesn't owe reparations to African immigrants or Caribbean immigrants, it's important to note that the 1870 Naturalization Act says otherwise, and that can be seen as reparatory as well. In the same way that the 14th Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments can be seen as reparatory for freedmen or freed Blacks in America. The 1870 Naturalization Act can also, in my view, be seen as reparatory for Black people everywhere, a reparation act for Black people everywhere. And so reparations, in the views of the American government, reparations was not just to their people that they enslaved, but to Africans as well, to an extent. So, the main point is that America at one point believed that reparations was owed to Caribbean immigrants, to African immigrants, and just Africans on the continent as well, who through the Naturalization Act, they allowed to come to the country.
All right, so that's about it for this video, guys. Thank you for your time and your attendance and your attention. Appreciate y'all. Don't know, hit that like button and everything else. Blessings.
I want you to listen very, very carefully.
Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Brought us from the motherland in bondage and chains. Bury our culture and change our names. They claim we're free, yet we are in pain. As long as there's life, there's a lot to gain. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. When God spoke his words, they said he was deranged. Marley sung his songs, they said the same. Malcolm X and Martin Luther fought relentlessly so we could be better. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Brought us from the motherland in bondage and chains. Bury our culture and change our names. They claim we're free, yet we are in pain. As long as there's life, there's a lot to gain. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they